Um, I hope everybody had a good lunch. I'm going to make a few comments about dual diagnosis and harm reduction because it's one of the areas where many of our clients show up. And the question is, what do you address first and second, and how does one affect the other? There isn't a uniform, there's a best practice. There's something called integrated dual disorder treatment, evidence-based practice. And I'm going to try and summarize some of the principles of that practice just to kind of set a context for our conversation about the clients that we'll be talking about, about the vignettes. So I think it's probably best to start with this idea of addiction and what is addiction and what are our predominant models of talking about addiction. The first thing is in a harm reduction approach, there's an acknowledgement that using drugs and using alcohol is part of life. It's not something that is about our clients any more than it is about us. And we have, all of us, maybe not, but many of us have had the very nice experience of drinking or smoking weed or doing other drugs that are incredibly soothing and pleasurable. So, in the beginning of the conversation about drug use with our clients, there is the acknowledgement that these things, these drugs that have been around, since Jesus turned the water into wine in Cana and probably a few thousand years before that, why are they around is because they are so good. They work and they take away our stress and our anxiety and uplift our feeling, make us more sociable, all the good stuff related to drug, alcohol use. So I think, step one is like, let's not pretend that it's us and them, it's just us, just different degrees of use, And I think what you want to convey in any conversation about this is that you understand, why people use and how that can be effective. And the question becomes, what's the problem with it? Does it get in the way? At what point does use become abuse, and at what point does abuse become a threat to residency or eviction? Like on a continuum. But that's a starting point. Here's another thing about abuse. I think more so than use. I think we all have some anxieties and issues that require some mindful meditation or yoga or smoking weed or having a glass of wine at 5 o'clock to take the edge off. So the people that typically have a more serious problem with drug use are people that have gotten into a loop where the level of anxiety is really much more profound, that it's really at the level of a trauma, that people have had bad things happen to them, whether it's physical abuse or sexual abuse or a severely broken heart in a relationship. It could be, a one-time incident of trauma, or often it's multiple incidents of trauma, but the trauma is unbearably painful. And people start to find that they need some help with it, and they reach to the drugs for help. This, what happens in the relief of the pain is that people start to get habituated to using the drug, and then it becomes all about drug use, and it becomes how do I get it, and where do I get it next, and it's already past the level of thinking about the trauma and into the level of like the lifestyle of what addiction looks like, which leads to more problems because there's a desperation to it and everything else. So if you're going to talk about drug use and addressing drug use, you could talk about it at the level of how do we fix this symptom, but where you want to get to is at the level of what started you using in the first place. You know, what was the pain that caused your use in the first place? There's a very it's a short book by a journalist named Maya Salovitz that talks about addiction in this way, in this treating of a broken heart. Actually, it's her own personal story where she was a student in college, and she was a person that was not very sociable, and so she ended up, she was in a relationship early on in her first year and fell madly in love with this man who a short time later left her. And she was beyond devastated. It's not, she didn't have a long history of relationships with others. This was something she felt was the love of her life. And when this man left, it was beyond bearable for her. And she began initially to smoke weed, and then she was drinking, and then she got her hands on some crack, and that was like a whole other level. And then ultimately ended up as a heroin user for about 3 years, just kind of like one thing after the other. And she went to several drug treatment programs, you know, during this time, you know, where the traditional approaches were, you know, abstinence-based. You've got to stop using, you know, do 30 days, do 90 days, and a kind of a tough love approach, which, you know, for her did not work. You know, she was suffering and she was aware of it. She was suffering from a broken heart, and tough love was not exactly what she was looking for. She was looking for sympathy. She was looking for understanding. She was looking for compassion. And what she was getting in these drug treatment programs was structure and support to kind of willfully get past it. You know, it wasn't working for her. And I think that, you know, that's, I want to premise this by saying, this is not like do this and don't do that, because many people will have testimonials about how these 12-step and abstinence-based programs have saved their lives. You know, they go and they get fellowship and support. So it's not like, you know, harm reduction is the opposite of abstinence-based or, you know, advocating for one over the other. Remember, we're talking about this in the context of a person-centered approach. So what you want to have is a number of different approaches available to you that makes sense to the person that you're working with. You know, if the person has been in detox and rehab before, and that's where they want to go, of course we're going to go there. You know, that's without question driven by the client's preferences and wishes. But if they've tried that over and over again and they keep relapsing and failing and they just don't want to try again, what do we do? Becomes the harm reduction approach of like, well, until we figure out how to get some control over this, can we at least minimize the harm related to this addiction problem or problem with addiction? The conversation, I don't know if many of you or some of you may be familiar with this idea of the stages of change model. This model by Clemente and D. Pershansky is a pretty standard conceptualization of a person's relationship with their own level of addiction. But I would argue it's also a very good way to conceptualize a person's level of relationship with their own psychiatric issues, whether it's serious psychiatric symptoms or depression or anxiety. And it talks about these stages that starts with, at the top, pre-contemplation, which means really, another way of saying that, frankly, would be denial. Like the person is not really willing to acknowledge that the drug use and having the friends over in the apartment was in any way related to the eviction, because the landlord's an asshole, and they called the cops, and and then this one, the case manager told this one, like all of the externalizations, but those sense of ownership that something about their behavior caused their problems. Now, that's going to be one kind of conversation that's going to be very different than someone who's like struggling to get into recovery. So, it goes from pre-contemplation to contemplation. The person has connected the dots and understands there's something that they're doing that's not turning out well, and they're thinking maybe they need help. That's a different conversation. That's like, what is it? What kind of help? And where do we go? And then the determination of making a plan and an action, leads to a kind of a more proactive role on our part, figuring out strategies to either get treatment or reduce harm. Also in the model, I think it's important to notice this thing about relapse, because in a harm reduction model, you have a different attitude about relapse than you would in the abstinence-based model. In the abstinence-based model, if you're clean for 90 days, and then it's a long weekend, and you go out and you have a bunch of beers with your friends, you are back to zero. You have failed the program. You start from the beginning again, and it's like, oh, you have failed. Whereas in a harm reduction approach, if you are back in the office on Monday and saying, really, I messed up, I drank, I wasn't trying to drink, I'm trying to be sober, you would look at that same 90 days of like, I'm so happy you're here. I mean, it's Monday, and you're back here again, addressing it right away, and you already finished 90 days. You can do this. You can do more. It's not considered a back to zero, but like half full, rather than half empty. It's an approach that's very much what they call strengths-based, and looking at the positive outcomes, in light of possible interpretations, focusing on that. But acknowledging that, this is not a linear road. This is not something that starts and ends all in a straight line. People try, they relapse, they give up, they get frustrated, they try again. And, it's a journey. It's a journey. And like we were saying this morning, we don't know if this journey is a 6-month journey or a 6-year journey, but it's a journey that we're signed up to participate in. And this applies, both to the mental health issues and the addiction issues. I mean, one of the cases we talk about is this example of a man who is hoarding, and doesn't appear to have a lot of awareness of how this collection of things is leading to problematic behavior. So their level of stage is quite early on in the process. So that's the addiction as a response to trauma, and many of you may have already understood this and practice in this way, that addiction really, as the quote says, is a signal for help. It's not a behavior to be extinguished. It's for us to understand someone using a lot. I think it's a framework that's useful is that this person is suffering, and it's really a call for help, and they don't have any better ways of coping at this time. And what can we do to give them some strategies or some options for managing this a little bit better? Trauma-informed care is this approach is typically referred to, and I think that I'm just going to skip a couple of these because we've already talked about the trauma history. There's different kinds of trauma, personal, collective. There's trauma from prejudice, repeated trauma. But the point of these identifying these different traumas is to, again, understand what this is for this person. Each person has their own. It's not a formula that I'm trying to convey here. It's an individualized approach, and every person's history of use and why they use is going to be as individualized as their fingerprint. That's one of the challenges of doing person-centered care. It's very individualized, and that's the only way that it really works well. It's not a suit that fits all. It's what is it for this person? The components, very consistent with that, developing a positive relationship we mentioned this morning as a way of maintaining the case management relationship. But here you're also striving for a sense that you are somebody that is willing to listen openly to what is going on for the person, that they are safe in communicating with you. Because you want them not only to initially communicate their use, which is very hard to get people to do, because we're not neutral participants in this. We go and we're the case manager. And so we may not think of ourselves as identified as a case manager. We're trying to do the best we can. But our clients have ideas about what case managers do and what they want to hear and what they tell us. So, there's a setup there between us and them, us making assumptions about them and them making assumptions about us, which is not, which gets in the way of an authentic and genuine conversation about why they use. So the conditions for having an open and honest conversation require the establishment of a relationship that feels sort of psychologically safe, and the person can talk to you about, I'm smoking a lot of weed because I'm so stressed out for these reasons. When you are participating in those kinds of authentic conversations, you're close to it, and then you want to go a little further and find out what was it exactly that triggered the excess use. Did someone say anything? Did something happen? And then you're getting into the more psychological aspects of it. What's weird about this business is that, we call it case management and intensive case management, but it's all really about healing. And, whether you want to be in the healing business or not, you are. And there's a certain kind of both, I think, ethical and professional responsibility, because whether we're identifying as therapists or not, people see us that way and will respond to us that way. And I think we want to be respectful of their expectations and feelings and sense of privacy, and create the conditions in those conversations that are like therapeutic conversations. I mean, not to shy away from that. And it may not even be in our job description, frankly, but the quality of the interaction and the content of the interaction that you have with the people that you're working with are very much in the line of therapy. It's not an office where they come in for 45 minutes and they tell you their dreams, but it's the real thing in the field in real time, whether it's at the grocery store or walking down the street. That's what you're striving for all the time, to get to know people at that level. So it's not the other piece of it, though. Once you're talking about that, you're talking about why did the use spike or trigger, or what was it that made the person more symptomatic in a particular situation? is the beginning of your intervention. Your intervention, step one, is creating the relationship that makes the conversation possible and open. And step number two is then strategizing with them. What could we do better? What could you do better? What can I help you do better? What do you need help with in order to reduce, not feel this way as much? Is there anything that we can put together in terms of a strategy that would not put you over the end that way? I think that this sort of speaks for itself, that we know why it's hard for people to open up about these things. There's a lot of shame associated with use and abuse, and there's even more shame associated with trauma and telling people about traumas that they've suffered. So it's, you're peeling layers of despair and denial, and opening up a kind of a conversation that doesn't happen very often for the people that we deal with. But the good thing about all of this is that we're not in a hurry. It's not like we have to get this done. What I'm talking to you about takes time, and to build this kind of trust takes time. And in these programs, because they are long-term, you do have the luxury of time to build to that. People are not going to open up because your 3-month treatment plan is due. People are going to open up at their own pace, at their own time, when they feel comfortable, and that takes time. So I think that this idea of how collaborative it is. We're not the experts. In fact, the only way we can be of any help at all is if people confide in us what it is that's bothering them. You might observe with them, help them connect the dots, but we really can't come up with a solution for this unless the person gives us the data about what it is that's troubling them. They are the experts of their own issues, and all we can do is facilitate that conversation and help them put it together in a new way that would be more useful. Why do you use, and what do you use? A lot of people use a lot of different things. And when and who do you use with, and how does all of this turn out for you? When is it okay, and when is it like over the top? There's this thing called the decisional behavioral balance, which is a way of, it's really a pluses and minuses, costs and benefits, just to keep in your own mind conceptually that when you're asking about what's the problem, you want to also ask, like, so what was the good part of that? What did you enjoy? Because if it was only one-sided, which is what your client thinks you want to hear, your client thinks you want to hear, oh, I'm going to quit, I'm going to go to treatment, I'm going to do better. Yeah, but how was it really? You want to hear why it works for them, because there are reasons they're using that it works. So I think you'll have a better sense of what the trade-offs are, and then they can consider them more openly when you can get to that part of the conversation. The example here says in that discussion of trade-offs, well, seeing my friends, why do you use in your apartment? Seeing my friends, giving my friends a warm place to stay, and keeping my apartment and not returning to the streets. Those are my goals. But then you have to point out that, giving your friends a warm place to stay and keeping your apartment may be a bit of a problem. Is there a way that you can manage both that won't put you at risk? Is there a time limit? Can people come over for the evening? Do they have to stay over for like 2 weeks? Just figuring it out with them. These are some other strategies about figuring out the amount of use and using less. Lots of times People are helped by having a budget and even having you manage the budget. So for example, at the beginning of the month, you pay all the bills with them, and then they might want you to give them like of what's left in the balance, something each week. I don't know if programs allow that, but this kind of money management piece has been quite effective for people who feel completely out of control. I think that's really, this is just a list of things that are talking about strategies for staying in touch. I think the thing that was not mentioned before that is really important here is related to the relapse piece, which is when people are in crisis and they relapse, they're going to want to avoid you because the shame and everything else, they don't want you to know. And that's actually the time that they need help the most. So that this figuring out a way to stay in touch with people through a crisis and supporting them through the crisis is a big part of this. And let's say it's a mental health crisis and the person gets hospitalized, or in some cases, some people are in their apartment and they are so depressed that you need to call an emergency involuntary commitment, a crisis mental health team, and the person is hospitalized involuntarily. That happens. And it's like, well, what does that do to the relationship? Well, it's going to be problematic temporarily, but I think following up and seeing the person while they're in the hospital, explaining why it was done and what your concerns were and why you called the crisis, goes a long way in helping the person understand, even if they don't agree with the intervention, that they understand your intention was to help. Your intention was a concern, your intention was their well-being and their safety. And people understand intention. They understand that sense of what you're conveying to them. I mentioned this morning, so I'm not going to go over it, but I did want to make sure that you understand this kind of approach is a very active and very not a passive acceptance, but an active approach. Some of the things that come up that are problematic is that people sometimes do very well with medication as a way of initially calming them down, as a substitute for drug use. And I don't know that there are any people who are prescribers in the room, but it takes a special psychiatrist or nurse practitioner to work in a harm reduction dual diagnosis treatment program, because you have to be willing to take the person's word for it and give them medication for their presenting problem if you hope to have a relationship with them. Because if you say, well, if I give you this and you're using, it's going to have a drug interaction, and I can't give you antidepressants because they don't interact well with your alcohol use, you're not going to have a therapeutic relationship with people. So the providers of medications that do well in integrated treatment really need to have not a risk-aversive approach, and need to have an approach that is client-driven to an extent. You may not want to prescribe something that is addictive for a symptom, but you can prescribe things that are calming and soothing without being addictive. You have to have someone that's willing to take that chance. And the final thing I want to say about this is that this is really hard work, and you're often exposed in your own work to all kinds of unsafe situations. You're going into apartments. Some people are at the extreme of use or have overdosed, and you've got to call emergency. Naloxone treatments are not uncommon. There's a lot of trauma that not only you're trying to elicit, but that you're exposed to on a daily basis if you're in a harm reduction program. And there's, I think that you would do well to have your team debrief, as a team, because I mean, going home and doing it is one thing, but people at work understand the work in a way that can support you better than someone who's kind of is listening to your story. So I definitely encourage you, if you're not already doing it, to have team meetings that are not about just the clients, but are also about your own teamwork and your own well-being, and how are we supporting each other, and how is this going as a part of self-care to working in these programs. I think that's it. Thank you.